In 1931, the drought that would come to define the decade had not yet earned its name, but the Missouri River had already begun to show what a dry year could do to a channel built on shifting sand. A few miles upstream of Sioux City, Iowa, near where the Big Sioux River empties into the Missouri, the water dropped lower that summer than anyone working the channel could remember. A line of stone piers came up out of the mud, where the current usually ran 6 feet deep. They stood in a row, evenly spaced, cut square at the top, dressed masonry of a kind nobody working the Corps of Engineers dike crews along that stretch had put there. The men who found them did not know what they were looking at. Nobody got much chance to find out. Within the week, the piers were gone, broken apart by a blasting crew clearing the channel for the barge traffic the 1827 River and Harbor Act extension had promised the towns along the river. What survives of that discovery is a scatter of second-hand testimony, a fragment of a private diary, and the annual reports the Corps filed with Congress that year, reports that record the tonnage of rock moved and the yards of channel dredged, and say nothing about what those piers were, who built them, or why removing them mattered enough to happen inside 7 days. The Corps had a schedule to keep and a river full of towns waiting on it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Missouri River had been a working problem for the federal government long before 1931. It is the longest river on the continent, better than 2,300 miles from its headwaters in Montana to the point near St. Louis, where it gives itself up to the Mississippi, and for most of that length it does not behave. It braids. It cuts new channels in a single flood season and abandons old ones to become oxbow lakes and dry sloughs within a decade. Steamboat captains in the 1800s called it the Graveyard River, and the name was not an exaggeration. More than 400 steamboats sank on the Missouri over the century of traffic that tried to run it, most of them not to storms or collisions, but to the river's own habit of shifting a sandbar overnight and putting a hull through it. One of those wrecks, the steamboat Bertrand, went down near DeSoto Bend, Iowa, in 1865, and when a salvage team finally located and excavated it in the 1960s, they found it buried under 30 feet of accumulated silt, sealed so completely that the cargo inside, including bottled goods and preserved food, had survived in near-perfect condition for a century. The Bertrand excavation, now curated by the National Park Service, proved something specific about this river that matters to the Piers story. The Missouri does not simply erode what falls into it, it buries things, fast and deep, and it can hold them for generations before an unusual season of water gives them back. Congress had been trying to discipline that unpredictability since well before the 20th century. Early snagging operations on the Missouri, clearing fallen trees and drift timber out of the channel with purpose-built snag boats, date back to the 1830s, following the same model Henry Miller Shreve had proven on the Mississippi and Red Rivers. A dedicated Missouri River Commission was established in 1884 to coordinate channel improvement work, and though that body was dissolved in 1902, its survey and engineering functions passed directly to the Army Corps of Engineers, which took over management of the river for the rest of the century and beyond. The River and Harbor Act of 1912 formalized the modern approach, authorizing a 6-foot channel project running from the river's mouth to Kansas City and meant to hold a dependable navigation depth regardless of season. In 1927, Congress extended that same project north to Sioux City, Iowa, adding more than 200 miles of river to the work list and placing the stretch near the mouth of the Big Sioux squarely inside federal jurisdiction, a jurisdiction that came with a mandate to move, not to preserve. Congress measured the project's success in barges cleared and freight tonnage carried. Figures reported each year alongside the engineering statistics, and no appropriations bill funding the work ever mentioned the possibility that the channel itself might hold something worth stopping for. The drought that exposed the piers was not a local curiosity. 1931 sat at the leading edge of a dry cycle that had already begun settling over the central United States the year before. a cycle that would deepen through the decade into the sequence of storms and crop failures remembered as the Dust Bowl. Precipitation across the Missouri Basin ran well below normal that summer. River gauges up and down the system recorded levels far under their seasonal averages, and the Corps' own engineers noted the low water repeatedly in that year's reporting as a complication for channel maintenance rather than as an opportunity. A channel that normally carried 6 feet of water at project depth can, in a season like that one, drop far enough to expose a riverbed that has not seen open air in years, sometimes in a generation. The organizational structure managing that channel had itself shifted only a few years earlier. The Omaha District Office had assumed responsibility for the upper reaches of the 6-foot project as it extended north through the 1920s, inheriting a stretch of river its engineers had not worked as long or as intimately as the crews further south, and inheriting, along with it, a schedule set by Congress rather than by local judgment about what the low water might be worth stopping to examine. The work itself was unglamorous and relentless. Pile dikes, built from timber pilings driven into the riverbed and packed with brush and quarried rock, were meant to narrow the channel and force the current to scour itself deeper on its own. Revetments of stone were laid along eroding banks to hold them in place through flood seasons. Snag boats worked the length of the river year-round, pulling drift timber out of the navigation lane before it could sink a loaded barge. Every one of these operations generated paperwork, and the paperwork survives. The annual report of the Chief of Engineers, published every year and submitted to Congress as a matter of law, recorded cubic yards of material dredged, linear feet of dike constructed, tons of stone placed in revetment, and dollars spent to the cent. It is one of the most exhaustive engineering archives produced by any branch of the federal government in this period, granular enough that a historian today can reconstruct, dike by dike, exactly how the Missouri Channel was rebuilt over 4 decades. In the report covering the fiscal year that included the summer of 1931, the section covering the Sioux City reach lists channel excavation, dike repair following the low water season, and a rock removal entry for a stretch of river bottom identified only by a river mile marker, with no description of what the rock was, where it came from, or why it required blasting rather than ordinary dredging. The entry exists. What it removed does not appear anywhere else in the federal record. The Missouri had known human traffic for a very long time before the Corps arrived to manage it, and the stretch near the Big Sioux confluence carries more of that traffic than most. The French explorers François and Louis-Joseph de la Vérendrye traveled up the river system in the 1740s, and in 1913 a group of schoolchildren playing on a bluff near Fort Pier, South Dakota, dug up a lead plate the brothers had buried in 1743, claiming the territory for France. The plate is real. It sits today in the collection of the South Dakota State Historical Society, and its rediscovery confirmed that European travelers had moved along the upper Missouri more than 60 years before Lewis and Clark's expedition passed through in 1804. By the time Meriwether Lewis and William Clark documented their own passage, the river valley was already marked by decades of fur trade contact. Manuel Lisa, a St. Louis merchant, founded the Missouri Fur Company in 1809 and built a chain of trading posts up the river, some of them near the same reach the Piers would later be found in, structures built quickly out of local materials and abandoned just as quickly when the trade moved on, with no requirement that anyone map or record them for posterity. One member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, Sergeant Charles Floyd, died near the site of present-day Sioux City in August of 1804 and was buried on a bluff overlooking the river, a grave that remains a designated National Historic Landmark to this day. By 1931, more than a century and a half of documented river traffic, fur trade and settlement had already passed through that exact stretch of water, leaving behind ferries, landings, trading post foundations, and structures that were built, used, abandoned, and in most cases never formally recorded by anyone with the authority or the interest to do so. The valley also holds a documented pre-contact archaeological record considerably older than any of that traffic, one that gives the investigation its clearest opportunity to rule something out rather than simply pile on more mystery. The Big Sioux and its tributaries run through the heart of what archaeologists classify as the territory of the Mill Creek culture, a settled, agricultural population that built fortified villages along the region's rivers roughly between the years 1100 and 1300, centuries before European contact. Excavations at Mill Creek culture sites, carried out across the 20th century by archaeologists including Dwayne Anderson, whose survey work on these villages remains a standard reference for the region, show substantial earth lodge construction, defensive ditches and storage pits, evidence of a stable and organized society that had no need to import its methods from anywhere else. But the building tradition the excavations document is timber, packed earth and ditch work, not dressed stone. Nothing in the published Mill Creek record describes quarried masonry piers of any kind, let alone piers cut from a stone as difficult to work as Sioux quartzite. If the 1931 structure has a pre-contact origin, it does not match the one regional building tradition that the archaeological record actually documents in detail, which narrows the range of honest explanations rather than widening it. What makes the 1931 piers difficult to file under any of those ordinary categories is the construction itself, according to the second-hand accounts that describe them. A typical 19th century river crossing in that region used timber cribbing filled with rubble, or later poured concrete footings once cement became cheap enough to ship in by rail. Manuel Lisa's trading posts, like most river trade structures of the period, were built from log and packed earth, not stone. The piers exposed by the drought were neither. They were dressed stone, cut and fitted rather than piled, laid in a straight line running roughly perpendicular to the old channel rather than parallel to it, a layout that rules out the most obvious civilian explanation of a ferry landing or a wharf, which would typically run parallel to the bank. The stone itself, based on the surviving description, was a hard pink-toned rock, consistent with Sioux quartzite, the same distinctive formation quarried commercially around Sioux Falls, South Dakota, roughly 70 miles to the north. Sioux quartzite is among the hardest building stones on the continent, harder than granite, and it resists hand tools to a degree that made it commercially unworkable until steam-powered channeling machines and diamond saws were developed specifically for it in the 1880s. Quarry companies around Sioux Falls used that stone through the turn of the century for courthouses, banks, and municipal buildings across the region, several of which still stand. A structure built from dressed Sioux quartzite therefore carries a narrow window of plausible origin. It is either a product of that commercial quarrying period, built after the machinery existed to shape it easily, which would place it inside the documented industrial era and inside the reach of ordinary record-keeping, or it predates that machinery and was shaped by some other method entirely, a possibility that raises the obvious question of who was cutting quartzite piers into a riverbed before the tools existed to do it without extraordinary effort. Setting the age question aside for a moment, the layout itself points toward function in a way the surviving description allows for, even if it cannot confirm it. A straight line of evenly spaced, squared piers running perpendicular to a channel is, structurally, the footprint of something meant to carry weight across the water rather than simply stand beside it. A trestle bridge, built to carry a wagon road, a rail spur, or later a highway, uses exactly this arrangement, a row of piers set at measured intervals to support a deck spanning between them. So does an aerial tramway of the kind used at some mining operations in the Mountain West to move ore across a valley on a cable, though no mining operation of that scale is documented anywhere near the Big Sioux confluence, and so does a simple footbridge or wagon crossing built by a landowner or a township before the county had the budget for anything sturdier. None of these possibilities requires the piers to predate the machinery capable of dressing Sioux quartzite. All of them are consistent with a structure built sometime after the 1880s and before it fell out of use and out of memory decades before 1931. Long enough for a working foreman to say only that the river usually kept it covered and that it had been there before anyone alive could remember. The surviving evidence does not resolve which of these the piers supported, or whether they supported anything at all by the time the drought exposed them. What it does establish is that the structure was purposeful, engineered, and built to a standard nothing else documented in that stretch of river matches. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The comparison that keeps surfacing in accounts of the find is the stone fish weir, a genuine and well-documented archaeological feature type recorded in rivers across North America. Weirs built from piled stone, arranged in a shallow curve pointing downstream to funnel fish into a trap, have been recorded and studied on the Damariscotta River in Maine, on stretches of the Potomac, and on rivers throughout the Pacific Northwest, some dated by archaeologists to several thousand years old. A stone weir is not, on its own, an anomaly. It is one of the most ordinary forms of pre-industrial river engineering there is, built by piling unworked fieldstone into a curve low enough to submerge and reappear with the seasons, never meant to be perfectly regular. What the 1931 witnesses described does not match that pattern. It was neither curved nor piled. It was a straight line of individually squared piers, evenly spaced, standing at a consistent height, a form with no functional resemblance to a fish trap and a much closer resemblance to the footings of a bridge or a dock, structures that require planning, surveying, and a level of stone dressing that fieldstone weir builders never attempted and had no reason to attempt. Drought exposing what a river or a reservoir normally hides is not unique to the Missouri in 1931, and the broader pattern is worth naming precisely because it shows how differently the same kind of discovery gets handled once legal protections exist. Lake Mead, the reservoir behind Hoover Dam, dropped to historic lows during the drought years of the early 2020s, and as the water fell, it exposed sunken boats, industrial debris, and the site of St. Thomas, Nevada, a town flooded by the reservoir's rising water in the 1930s, and periodically visible again whenever drought pushes the lake low enough. Those exposures were documented, photographed, and in some cases formally surveyed by the National Park Service, because federal law by then required it. The Missouri itself echoed 1931 on a smaller scale in 1988, when a severe drought across the Midwest dropped river levels enough to disrupt barge traffic and expose sandbars and debris up and down the channel, an event covered in regional newspapers at the time. By 1988, any structure exposed in a federal navigation channel would have triggered a review process under the National Historic Preservation Act, a law that did not exist 57 years earlier when the Piers came up out of the mud near the Big Sioux confluence. The difference between those two droughts, separated by less than 6 decades on the same river, is not the water. It is the paperwork that existed to slow a blasting crew down long enough to ask a question. Whoever built the piers, the record of what happened to them in 1931 is thin by design rather than by accident. The Missouri River Channel Project operated under a strict production schedule. Congress funded the 6-foot channel work in annual appropriations, and district engineers were evaluated on how many miles of channel they brought up to project depth within the fiscal year, not on what they preserved along the way. There was no legal mechanism in 1931 that would have required the Corps to stop, document, or report an unexpected structure encountered during channel work. The National Historic Preservation Act, which would eventually require federal agencies to assess the archaeological impact of projects like channel dredging, would not exist for another 35 years. Before 1966, a district engineer who hit something unusual in a dredge cut had exactly one obligation, which was to clear it and keep the schedule. Blasting a line of stone piers out of a navigation channel was not a decision that required approval beyond the local district office, and it was not a decision anyone was required to explain afterward, in writing or otherwise. The blasting crew that cleared the site worked under the district's standing channel excavation contract, one of dozens of similar contracts running that season across the full length of the 6-foot project. The work order that likely covered the removal survives only as a line item, a rock obstruction cleared from the navigation channel at a specified river mile, with a tonnage figure and a cost figure, and nothing describing the obstruction's shape, age, or origin. This was standard practice for the era. Corps engineers were trained to record engineering outcomes, dredged yardage and dike footage and project depth achieved, not archaeological ones, and a foreman with a barge schedule to protect had no incentive to slow a crew down to sketch or photograph something that was, from his perspective, simply in the way of the cut. The men who actually saw the piers before they were destroyed were laborers, not engineers, and a Depression-era river crew kept its jobs by working, not by asking questions about what it was told to blow apart. 1931 sat at the front edge of the Depression, before any of the relief programs that would later put unemployed men to work documenting the built landscape existed. The Works Progress Administration, which would eventually fund some of the era's most careful salvage archaeology on other rivers, was still 4 years from being created. In 1931, a crew clearing a federal navigation channel had no such safety net of documentation standing behind it. It had a contract, a deadline, and dynamite. What became of the broken stone afterward is not recorded either, though the most likely answer is the least dramatic one, and, in its own way, the most complete erasure of all. Revetment crews working the same reach that season needed quarried rock by the ton to hold the banks against the current, and blasted stone from a channel obstruction was, from a foreman's perspective, simply material on hand, rather than material to be studied. If the piers were broken down to a size a work crew could load onto a barge, there is a real possibility that pieces of dressed Sioux quartzite masonry, shaped by hands and tools nobody could identify, ended up packed into a revetment somewhere downstream, holding a riverbank in place under the same current that used to run over the structure they came from. No inventory exists that would confirm or rule this out. The Corps tracked tonnage of rock placed in revetment work that year with the same bureaucratic precision it tracked everything else, but tonnage records do not distinguish a quarried block bought fresh from a quarry contract from a broken pier pulled out of the channel a few miles upstream. If the evidence went into the riverbank, it is still there today, indistinguishable from 10,000 other stones doing the same job. The one account that survived outside the official record came from a diary kept by a young man who worked that season on the dike crew stationed near the Big Sioux confluence, a diary that surfaced decades later in the hands of a local historical society and has never been formally authenticated or published in full. The Society's own accession notes, according to the librarian who has fielded inquiries about it, describe the diary arriving in a box of family papers donated by a grandchild sometime in the 1970s, one notebook among several years of ordinary entries about weather, wages, and river work, with no indication the family understood what the single page about the piers might mean to anyone outside the household. According to the fragments that have circulated, the writer described wading out at low water to look at the piers before the blasting crew arrived, counting what he estimated to be 9 or 10 of them running out from the bank at even intervals, each one roughly waist-high above the mud and squared off cleanly at the top, as if built to hold something that was no longer there. He described an older foreman on the crew, a man who had worked the river for decades, telling him the piers had been there before anyone alive could remember, and that the river usually kept them covered, surfacing only in the driest years. The same foreman, according to the diary, said he had heard of similar stonework further upriver near the mouth of the James, though nothing was ever done to look into it. The diary account is second-hand, unverified, and impossible to confirm against any surviving photograph, since no photograph of the piers is known to exist in any public archive or private collection that has come forward. It should be read as a fragment of local memory rather than as documented fact. But it is the only human voice on record who claims to have seen the structure before it was gone, and the detail he recorded, that the river usually kept the piers covered and that only an unusually dry year exposed them, matches the physical situation precisely. 1931 sat at the front edge of the drought years that would deepen through the decade and eventually earn the name the Dust Bowl, and low water severe enough to draw the channel down several feet below its normal working level was, by every account of the period, an unusual event, even by the standards of a river already known for running thin some summers. The diarist did not stay on the river long after that season. Core dike crews in this period were seasonal labor, hired for the working months and let go when the channel work wound down for winter, and there is no record of the same name appearing on any later crew roster the Historical Society holds for that district. Whatever he saw in the mud that summer, he carried it with him into an ordinary life the record does not otherwise follow, and it surfaced only because a family kept a box of papers longer than most families do. The stretch of river near the Big Sioux confluence looks nothing today like it did in 1931. The channel work that removed the piers was itself only a preliminary phase of a much larger transformation that followed in the decades after. The Pick-Sloan Missouri Basin Program, authorized by Congress in 1944, placed a series of massive dams along the upper Missouri, and their combined effect on the river was total. Garrison Dam in North Dakota, completed in 1953, flooded more than 150,000 acres of the Fort Berthold Reservation, forcing the relocation of the 3 affiliated tribes from the bottomlands their communities had occupied for generations. A documented and still remembered federal decision that stands as one of the most consequential in the entire Pick-Sloan program. Fort Randall Dam, completed in 1956, and Gavin's Point Dam near Yankton, South Dakota, completed the following year, together regulate the flow through the exact reach where the piers were found, and the towns along the upper river paid a price of their own. Niobrara, Nebraska, was relocated to higher ground entirely when the reservoir behind Gavin's Point rose to cover its original town site. The river that briefly exposed the piers in a dry year no longer behaves the way it did in 1931. Its levels are managed upstream by reservoir releases rather than by rainfall, which means the specific combination of drought and channel geometry that uncovered the structure for a matter of days may never recur in a form anyone could observe again, even if some fragment of the piers survived the original blasting still buried in the riverbed beneath 90 additional years of dredged and redeposited sediment. No formal archaeological survey has ever been conducted at the site, and none is likely to be. The exact river mile referenced in the 1931 work order sits within a channel that has since been dredged, revetted, and reshaped repeatedly under the same navigation project that removed the original structure, and the Corps of Engineers continues to maintain that channel today under the same reporting standard it used in 1931, tonnage and cost and river mile, with no requirement to note what else might come up in the cut. Whatever the piers were built for, and whoever cut them from a stone that resisted hand tools until industrial machinery arrived to shape it, the answer went into a blasting crew's work order in 1931 and came back out as gravel. The only trace that survives above the waterline is a line in a diary nobody can authenticate, describing a foreman who said the river usually kept the piers covered, and a river that, 90 years later, no longer runs low enough on its own to show anyone whether he was right. Ground-penetrating radar and sonar surveys of the modern riverbed near the confluence exist only in the form of routine channel condition surveys the Corps runs, to plan its own maintenance dredging, data collected for engineering purposes, and never released for or reviewed against any archaeological question. Nobody has requested that comparison, and nobody working for the district has reason to run one, since as far as the current maintenance program is concerned, the reach in question is simply channel, cleared once in 1931 and kept clear every year since. The stretch of river that briefly held a line of squared quartzite piers now looks, from the surface, exactly like every other mile of managed channel between St. Louis and Sioux City, indistinguishable to a boat passing over it, and unremarkable in every report filed about it since. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.